So I would like to welcome our viewers to a phenomenology of the phenomenon. This is a series where we discuss the application of the philosophical tradition of phenomenology to the study of unidentified aerial phenomena and close encounters. This series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies. I am the host, Kimberly Engels, and I am very excited about my guest today, Dr. Michael E. Zimmerman, who is Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder. So, Michael, first of all, I just want to thank you very much for being here with me today.
Glad to be here.
Excellent. So, to tell the viewers a little bit more about Michael, as I said, he's Professor Emeritus at University of Colorado Boulder, received his Ph.D. from Tulane University in 1974 after spending a year as a Fulbright Fellow in Belgium. He's the author of 4 books and over 100 articles and book chapters. This is quite impressive. His research and teaching specialties include Heidegger's phenomenology, environmental philosophy, philosophy of technology, Buddhism as philosophy, philosophy and science fiction, philosophy of technology, philosophy and gender, and most relevant to this, the philosophical aspects of the alien abduction phenomenon. He is the winner of several teaching awards and has always enjoyed the opportunity to acquaint students with different ways of making sense of the world. Now retired, he lives in New Orleans with his wife and daughter. So once again, Michael, just thank you so much for being here. So excited to have you on what is actually the very first episode of this series. Before we dive into, the interview questions, I would like to start with a first defining phenomenology for our listeners and viewers who may not be familiar with this method. So I'm going to put out, a general definition and then ask you if there's anything you'd like to add to it. So phenomenology is a philosophical method that's rooted in a rigorous examination of first-person consciousness. So Edmund Husserl was the founder of phenomenology, a German philosopher, and he advocated essentially a method of bracketing in which we suspend judgment on the source or origin of what is being interacted with and describe what appears. So a phenomenological analysis involves describing exactly what appears to the individual, as well how what appears is received, organized, and classified by the conscious subject. So with phenomenology, we have to be very careful about describing exactly how an object is being given or presented to consciousness. Is it a perceptual object being given in sense experience? Or is it a remembered object, something you encountered previously, an imagined object? While the scientific method is focused on collecting physical evidence that can be objectively verified in controlled conditions, the phenomenological method rigorously examines the experience of the witness, what they saw, what they heard, what they sensed, what they felt, and what they formed judgments about, and how they formed those judgments. So, Michael, with that kind of preliminary definition, is there anything that you would want to add or just say about phenomenology in general for our viewers and listeners?
Well, yes, I'll make a few comments, but I would like to begin by saying thank you very much. I'm honored to be your inaugural guest on this series. And you and I have exchanged emails and had a lot of good philosophical discussions already. And I admire what you're doing here. So,
thank you very much.
Okay, I would add only this. It is extremely difficult to do this phenomenological analysis. I started meditating about 40 some years ago and did some long-term retreats and all kind of things. And one of the things Asian religious and philosophical traditions talk about is the monkey mind, the very great difficulty of keeping the mind on anything for any length of time. Everyone knows what it's like, the constant wavering back and forth. So there's a discipline involved in phenomenology, as there is in meditation. People who've had a meditation experience would be a very good, perhaps very good phenomenologists, should they choose to go in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. To rigorously and carefully examine conscious experience, that takes a disciplined mind and absolutely careful control of your experience, which actually I want to dig into a little bit more later on in this discussion, but I think it's a great thing to add at the beginning. So, Michael, in 1997, you published an article, and it was actually quite remarkable in retrospect. Now that I've spent some time, writing about this topic, attempting to publish about this topic, I actually know how difficult it is to get a philosophy journal to want to publish on this topic. So in retrospect, I'm very impressed and really want to commend you for getting this out there. You published an article in Philosophy Today called "The Alien Abduction Phenomenon: Forbidden Knowledge of Hidden Events." And in addition to this having to be very high quality to get published in this journal, I think it also just took some courage to be willing to, publicly, put yourself out there as, saying that the abduction phenomenon was something that philosophers should be looking at and taking seriously. And obviously now in retrospect, I think you were correct. But it took some conviction to do that, and I just want to commend you a bit. But in this article, one of the things that you mention is that one of the reasons that there's so little academic discussion of things like alien abduction encounters is that they violate the prevailing social ontology, which is kind of the official social agreements about what kind of things are real and aren't real, that kind of define the boundaries of the real and the true in modern Western democracies. And you discuss this concept. You say that the social ontology is really dominated by anthropocentric humanism. So what I wanted you to do for our listeners today is if you could both just explain that concept a little bit. What is anthropocentric humanism? How is it really the dominant social ontology? And then I'd like to discuss a little bit about how anthropocentric humanism influenced phenomenologists, especially the foundational phenomenologists such as Husserl or Heidegger or Sartre, who themselves were also influenced by anthropocentric humanism.
Okay, I was thinking about this topic the last few days, and it is a big topic.
It is.
But I will try to summarize it in this way. There is a trajectory to Western history. I think this is something we should keep in mind when trying to understand why we are in the situation we're in today. For example, about to hand off the future of our species to artificial general intelligence. This is an interesting moment, and it didn't arrive by accident. A crucial event happened in around 1200 AD, and that was, first of all, the Crusades were going on, but what was more important was the returning with the Crusaders to Europe were ancient Greek documents completely unknown to the Western world. So much of the Greek that we know about now, Aristotle and Plato in any depth, plus playwrights and so on, was brought over in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries by Europeans returning from Jerusalem back to France and so on, Italy. At this time, in the 1400s, in Italy especially, people like Dante and Erasmus, well-known literary and philosophical figures, were beginning to restore to the Western tradition the importance accorded to the human, both the human form and to the human mind, that the Romans and Greeks accorded to the human being. In the intervening time, there was a great era of Christianity. The recovery of these ancient Greek texts, though, as well as the problems with Christianity of which had become encrusted and corrupt in some ways, prompted a new stance, or a recovery of a stance, which regarded the human being as noble, as worthy of development, and requiring education of a sort to develop the qualities of persons, so that the dawn of what we call humanism, they didn't use this term. That term was developed in the 19th century, probably by German, French, and English classicists. We need to recall that higher education until the late 19th, early 20th century was really all about the classics. Science did not have that place until it started to in the mid-late 19th century in Germany. So the humanists, people who studied these ancient Greek texts, learned Latin and Greek and so on, promoted the arts, the letters, and so on. This was what became the humanities ultimately in our American universities. We mirrored Europeans and universities in this way. The early forms of humanism retained the cosmology of ancient times, and that was, you could call, there's a wonderful book about this called The Great Chain of Being. The concept was this: at the top of the great chain of being is God, or you might even say God isn't at the top because God isn't a creature. So the great chain of being is really the great chain of creatures in a way. God stands outside but embraces all this. But then you might have a kind of divinity, and then all the angels and critters between us, the planets, were regarded as intelligences, and so on. The whole universe was in multiple layers of intelligence. And then you come down to humans, which are way down on the lower realms because the material plane of the earth is gross compared to the ethereal realms of the stars and so on. So developing a form of self-respect, developing human dignity and human knowledge did become a new way of navigating the world. Now, something happened along the way. You now had with Galileo in Italy, discovering how you can apply mathematics to the activity of physical objects, right through Descartes and Newton, the rise of modern mathematical sciences and everything that went with it. There developed an increasing skepticism about this great chain of being. And at some point, God became regarded as the creator who got things going, but then just stepped back, and the universe now is running on its own. And eventually, by the 18th and 19th century, a kind of atheism, at least agnosticism, came on the scene. And we're very familiar with that now in the 20th and 21st century. Now, what is anthropocentric humanism? In addition to all the good qualities of learning the humanities and languages and literature and so on, there came a new aspect of all this, and that in a way comes from Darwin. Now, one of the things that Darwin came up with was the concept of the struggle of the struggle for survival leads to greater fitness and so on. Now, this started to be applied to human beings. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the whole idea of racial types, the decline of racial types, the importance of making races stronger and so on, this led into National Socialism, which was furthered by the eugenics developed in the United States. It's quite a sorry history to study it, but it's perhaps understandable given the power of the Darwinian concept. So you might say that anthropocentric humanism is a humanism which regards the entire planet as a stockpile of raw material for enhancing human well-being and human prospects. Plants, animals, rivers, mountains, and everything on the planet or inside of it to be mined, to be extracted, and put to use for our purposes. Because there's nothing higher than us, the assumption is human beings are on the top of the cosmic heap. There were abstract conception of perhaps beings on other planets and so on. But when it really got down to it, it's really all about human beings. So anthropocentric humanism becomes a kind of license to assault Mother Earth, as how many environmentalists would say back in the 1970s and 80s. And so that's part of what anthropocentric humanism is. Now, someone like Husserl and many other people in the late 19th, early 20th century philosophers, scientists, educated people, assumed something like this attitude. You could add to this fact that this was the age of colonialism, and many white Europeans assumed that they were superior. You could, for example, invade India and gradually take it over because, well, why? Well, because we have better technology, basically, and we were able to do that. So anthropocentric humanism is an expansion beyond anything the early humanists could have imagined, Petrarch and Dante's time, of a humanistic attitude with a kind of a license to take over the planet. And now, of course, it's all about the galaxy when you look at Star Trek and beyond.
Thank you. That was a really good introduction to that concept and where it originated. I see the influence of anthropocentric humanism in phenomenologists like Husserl and, those who were influenced by him, like Heidegger and Sartre, because within their thought is really this idea that the human being is the source of all meaning and value in the universe. So it is a rigorous experience, a rigorous examination of conscious experience. But there's these assumptions embedded into their thought that human consciousness is kind of the ultimate lens through which to examine the world. It's kind of the lens that's the closest to the truth. And what meaning conscious experience has is given, maybe it's collective meaning given by the social whole, or it's, meaning projected onto the situation by the individual person. But in both cases, it's, meaning and value is coming from human beings alone.
Well, let me yes, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I would say this, though, Heidegger was somewhat different. In fact, I recall when I was studying in Belgium back 50 some years ago, Heidegger's 2-volume collection of basically lecture courses came out in German. And I spent the second half of my Fulbright over there. I was writing my dissertation, but I was devouring these texts on Nietzsche. And Heidegger makes Nietzsche, regards him as kind of a culminating figure in the history of metaphysics, which he regards as the history of the increasing status of the human being in the world as Lord of creation, basically. He sees that's where things are going, such that everywhere we look, we really see ourselves looking back. Everything is a representation that we create. Everything becomes amenable to our mathematical physics and so on. And he resisted this anthropocentric humanism. He said that what we call consciousness is itself not something that humans create. It's not something the same with language. Language and consciousness are gifts of a kind. In other words, the human being has imposed upon it this openness, this clearing within which things can show up and manifest themselves in their various ways. And that our problem is that we identify so closely with a certain kind of looking, a looking that's all about domination and conquest and use value, that no other aspect of things really is allowed to show up. I think consider today, the final move in the history of 20th century and 21st century higher education has been the gradual diminution of the humanities and what looks like the ultimate triumph of STEM disciplines. And why should that be? Well, because STEM gives us the power, whereas the humanities give us a kind of reflective ability, a capacity to evaluate and assess and reassess our motives, our historical origins, how we differ and are same, and so on. And so the triumph of STEM, motivated heavily by World War I and II, with the role science and technology played, then followed by the arms race, the missile race in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So a lot of this has resulted from historical circumstances. Nevertheless, Heidegger, I think, was one who pushed back on anthropocentric humanism and helped develop a critique of it.
Thank you. I've done much more with Husserl, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty than with Heidegger, so it's nice to have that addition here, that he kind of stood out and wasn't as heavily influenced by anthropocentric humanism as some of these other founding figures. I mean, one thing that I see emerging, a lot of phenomenologists, or several, Sartre for one, they have an encounter with the other. But the encounter with the other, it's always a human other, right? I don't know much about, these potential encounters with a non-human other. I mean, I know that you wrote actually a piece about encountering, a completely alien otherness, another article that you wrote. But it seems to be in their analyses of social relations, or just their basic analyses of, or their descriptive takes on how we navigate and encounter the world. It's really a world that's void of, what we might consider supernatural things, or any type of intelligence that's not a human intelligence. Those types of encounters really are not explored within the classical phenomenologists.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's true for Heidegger as well. I mean, Heidegger, like Husserl and Sartre, these people went through a rigorous higher educational program where the Wissenschaft, this is the German word for science, Wissenschaft, it means knowledge making, basically. And there are two kinds. There's Naturwissenschaft, is what we call natural science, and Geisteswissenschaft, which is really about the human spirit, or you might say the world of culture. But even in that domain, which would include philosophy, there is a wissenschaftlich, a scientific angle to it. It has to be rigorous and disciplined and informed by specialists and so on. So the development of phenomenology in the early 20th century reflects, I think, a widespread assumption that the only things that are real are things that you can encounter in a normal state of consciousness. And so Husserl developed this idea of the natural attitude that's universal, that's shared by everyone, that's all about the unity, kind of the predictability of the world. And there is truth to that. Every, I suppose, tribe and member of our species from way back, they had a sense of how things were supposed to be when everything was going right. Now, perturbations, intrusions could occur, but they were typically because of weather or wild animals or disease or comets or other kind of strange things that might happen. But you're not going to hear Husserl, I mean, I've never seen it in his work, talking about poltergeists, ghosts, UFOs, critters, cryptids, Bigfoot. I mean, the wild set of phenomena widely reported really throughout human history. I mean, people have been encountering these weird things. They don't have any status in the world of anthropocentric humanism apart from the possibility that these are psychotic episodes or attributable to psychotic episodes in which various kinds of hallucinations and strange dysfunctions of the human mind, human organism, that these can arise under those circumstances. So the possibility of an encounter with a non-human other, apart from an animal, but a non-human other that is intelligent, at least as intelligent as human beings, but perhaps vastly more so, this is just not on the table. Not for Heidegger, not for any of these people. It would have been kind of embarrassing to do so. Now, I will add this one thing. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, as we know from Jeff Kripal's work, his first or second book was a study of the spiritualist tradition that included people like William James. Freud was interested. Lots of people were interested with the possibility of having mediums contact people from the world beyond, after death. And there were tremendous seances, carefully studied by, rigorous natural scientists, and they often could not explain what was going on. So there were outbreaks of this kind of thing, pushing against a naturalistic humanism, anthropocentric humanism, which is kind of a reductionism, turning everything into a predictable matter and energy mechanism and so on. These were breakout moments when very smart people said, hey, look, there's something more going on here.
Absolutely. I think James definitely stands out as a philosopher who took these types of, what we might call supernatural or paranormal or anomalous phenomena very seriously.
Yes.
They're not reducible to some type of psychopathology, which is so often what those influenced by anthropocentric humanism want to reduce them to. So Michael, I'd like to turn now. You mentioned it briefly. You talked about Husserl's natural attitude, and I'd like to dive into that concept a little bit more. I want to read a couple of quotes about this natural attitude because it's a very important concept for Husserl, kind of the everyday way in which we encounter the world. So Robert Sokolowski describes it as such. He says, the natural attitude is the focus we have when we are involved in our original world-directed stance, when we intend things, situations, facts, and any other kind of objects. End quote. And then here's a quote from Husserl himself from his book Ideas 1. I am conscious of a world endlessly spread out in space, endlessly becoming and having endlessly become in time. I am conscious of it. That signifies above all that intuitively I find it immediately. I experience it by my seeing, touching, hearing, and so forth. And in the different modes of sensuous perception, corporal physical things with some spatial distribution or other are simply there for me, on hand, in the literal or figurative sense, whether or not I am particularly heedful with them or busied with them in my considering, thinking, feeling, or willing. End quote. So, Husserl said, this kind of everyday, natural, practical attitude, it's kind of the default way in which we encounter our environment as there for us to kind of use for our needs. It's maneuverable, it's predictable. It stands in contrast to the phenomenological attitude where we're being more intentional and descriptive about what is appearing. But in some discussions that you and I have had, as well as in a recent essay that you were working on, you could critique his concept of the natural attitude a bit, because Husserl thought that this attitude was essentially universal. But you've pointed out that you think that it changes, and I agree with you. Both in terms of cultures, but also in terms of time periods. And things that would seem to disrupt the natural attitude in our modern scientific culture in Western democracies that is influenced by anthropocentric humanism wouldn't necessarily have been seen as disruptive in pre-modern cultures or perhaps Native American cultures. So I'd just like you to say a little bit more about that, this critique of, Husserl's assumption that the natural attitude is universal.
Yes, that's a good topic, and one that I came upon kind of by accident. I read an interesting review of a recent book by a woman philosopher. I forget even the title of the book, but the reviewer pushed to the foreground this whole idea of the everyday or the natural attitude in Husserl, and I got to thinking about it. And Husserl offers a pretty stripped down view of the world from that quote you gave, all right? There's no emotion, there's no conflict, there's no complexity. I mean, in other words, it's kind of a three-dimensional depiction of a universe studied by the sciences, devoid of human subjectivity or culture. So, and there's truth to it, of course. Perhaps every culture assumes that, when you take a step, you're assuming that the earth will stay there till your foot hits the ground. There is a kind of naive realism that's widely shared. But the cultural factors here are totally neglected, it seems to me. Now, Husserl did try, I think, later to do a better job of the Lebenswelt, the lived world, the experienced world, and recognized he was receiving feedback about this, that he had to do a better job of this. But so I was focusing on an early statement of his, one that reflects his scientific objectivity and the what normal way of taking things at his time. So let me move up to Heidegger to give an example of this, because Heidegger derived from Husserl this notion. He called it everydayness, the everyday way of being in the world. And it's a terrific examination of a cobbler, a shoemaker in his little shop. And the shoemaker, the shoe repair person, he's totally absorbed in what he's doing or she's doing. It's all about, he's got the owl here, it's tying up this, he's cutting and pasting them. And all of a sudden he can't find a tool. And he can't go on. And Herr Schmidt is coming in 2 hours to pick up the shoes. And what am I going to do? Should I go down the street? So all of a sudden, this network of connections that constitute his everyday world of customers and people who have products he needs, his own activity as a cobbler, I'm going to lose my reputation, I'm not, all that stuff suddenly shows up. There's a big opening there for the individual. Now, this is a very good account of our own everyday practice when we get absorbed in things. One of the reasons people like to get absorbed is because the world goes away. It's just what we're doing in front of us. All your worries about this, that, and the other thing are gone. And I think that's one reason we like this absorption. But this interruption takes us away from that. But let me give you the problem here. This is an account of an 18th, 19th century workshop, which was already being completely dismantled in Germany, which underwent the most rapid industrialization of any European country in history, basically. Starting in the 1870s with Bismarck, they collapsed into a 20, 30, 40-year period, incredible social transformation, which had vast consequences for the population. I don't know if any listeners or you, for that matter, have ever seen Charlie Chaplin's movie Modern Times. It's well worth seeing. It came out in 1936, I think, 9 years after being in time. But it depicts poor Charlie. He had his stock characters. The guy is kind of a fall guy for the world. But he's shown at one point he's traveling through gears, which are moving his body through this machinery. Now, this is the experience of industrial employment that people were experiencing in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. This is not the world of the workshop. For the sake of which, in other words, the reason the work's being done in the workshop is for the customer, but also for the workman, the cobbler. But what's going on in the industrial factory? You might not even know what you're actually making. Your presence in the world is taken for granted. You, in fact, become a cog in the machine, as Charlie was experiencing, going around those gears. And I think there's an example of a dramatic transformation of the taken for granted everyday world. That's a very different place. And Heidegger got to this change in his thinking through studying the writings of Ernst Jünger, a very famous, highly decorated German soldier, who wrote about his hallucinogenic experiences in the trenches in technological warfare. His book called In the Storm of Steel was an international bestseller about what it's like to be a soldier in the modern age. And this, I think, transformed Heidegger's thinking about a lot of matters and led into his lectures on Nietzsche, which were deeply informed by the fact that Jünger called on Nietzsche precisely to interpret the will to power evident in the modern technological world. I hope that summary wasn't too compressed.
No, absolutely, and it's very interesting actually, because it's not just that the everydayness or the natural attitude, it varies, as we said, from culture to culture, but also when we make major transitions in something like a technological revolution, and have moved into kind of the era of living with technologies in the ways that we do, those also lead to profound changes in everydayness, profound changes in the assumptions that we make about, how the world operates.
Can I give another example of this that would be,
Yeah, absolutely.
Contemporary audience would really get this. Recently, my wife and I watched two films representing, one was Love Story from 1970-71. The other one was the Holdover with Giamatti playing the role of the teacher staying over the holiday in about 1968 or 70 in a private school. And a totally analog world. I don't think there was even a radio in anything. I mean, there was no, it was like going back in time. The first encounter I had with this change that was coming was walking through Audubon Park across from Tulane University in New Orleans about 50 years ago. It must have been like 1975 or 6, whenever the Sony Walkman came out, where you had your little earphones and your transistor radio, and you could listen to music while walking through Audubon Park. Now, when I saw the first person with these, I said, wow, this guy is cutting himself off from the ambient world of kids playing and people talking and listening to the ducks and the breeze. And he's now isolating himself inside these earphones. And I was thinking about that moment. And now we have the cell phone, probably the worst invention in human history in terms of destruction of ordinary human relationships, plus the devastating consequences, especially for young people, of social media, heavily mediated by the cell phone. And this is a precursor for where we're going? It's a very disturbing thing. So those of us raised pre-digital can see a stark difference between life then and now. There are plenty of downsides then, and a lot of great things have been brought forth. But the description I just gave of the role of digital media and cell phones, this changed the social cultural landscape for everyone.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you walk around in New York City today, almost everybody, has a cell phone and earbuds in. They're totally removed from,
Right.
the what's going on practically or immediately around them. It's really a change in that norm in terms of how we tend to experience the world. Keeping on this, topic here of the natural attitude, I'm really interested in, Native American cultures and how, in many Native American societies, encounters with non-human intelligences were and are an everyday part of life, in a way that they really are not for, the societies that are influenced by scientific modernism. Many, Native American tribes have, contact with, what are perceived as extraterrestrials or some type of star being or sky being, as part of their creation stories or the histories of their tribal people. There's been several books on this subject. R.D. Six-Killer Clark wrote about, several volumes of the stories of Native Americans, having contact with the star people. Nancy Red Star has published a book on this. And John Mack, who I haven't really mentioned much yet, but, famous for the Harvard psychiatrist who studied the abduction phenomenon and who you were very familiar with. He interviewed 3 indigenous medicine people in his book, Passport for the Cosmos, or Passport to the Cosmos, because they all had reported contact with, what are perceived, what we would call extraterrestrials, as a regular part of their tribal life. So we see also, I think, in addition to the changes in the natural attitude in these time periods, huge variations in what's an accepted everydayness, varying from culture to culture, especially indigenous cultures.
Yes, first of all, I read all of those R.D. Six-Killer Clark books. I thought they were fantastic. She would interview all these. She became known as the UFO lady. She was a professor and a social scientist and did a lot of traveling around the American West on business or educational purposes. and people would come up to her and they would tell her their stories. And I highly recommend her work. I'd not heard of the second author, but I will follow up on that. Yes, so for these people, and think about this too, for our own ancestors, European in case for us, but European, whether it's African, whether you're from South America, wherever, tribal and later traditional people always had the assumption that there were these realities that could kind of just bleed right in. And William James talked about it. He said, the other side is not, it's like just a little screen that can come in and intrude right into your everyday reality. And so the Clarke books are full of incredible stories of these star people, the legends, the lore, and the actual belief around their intervention in their history. I'll give you an example of this. Ayahuasca. Now, ayahuasca is, as you know, an entheogen, which is a substance which basically helps create an encounter with the gods or God. Psychedelics doesn't really cover that right. But anyway, I read a book a while back. I'm very interested in the kind of entities that show up under DMT and these other entheogens because they seem to be realer than real. And it's just part of understanding how consciousness works that attracts me to this. I have never done, I'm a psychedelic virgin, as it were. I've never done any of those. I'm tempted to. But here's the point. The main ingredient in ayahuasca is a kind of alkaloid. Now, there's a long process of preparation to get the stuff into the shape to give someone to take. But there are 80,000 alkaloids in the Brazilian rainforest. I mean, in that rainforest in the middle of South America. When asked by a scientist, a cultural anthropologist, how they figured out which one, the native shaman said, "Oh, we couldn't find it. The gods gave it to us. Came from them, from the sky people." I don't know if it used that term, but that was the point. Now, there's two things here that I think it's worth thinking about here in regard to this cultural change thing. You have people like Jacques Vallée and many others contemporary with him, emphasizing that UFOs or UAP have showed up historically all over the world, and that they've had an effect on human culture. That there's some control structure, some educational structure that is going on and we don't know who's behind it. That's the big question. Now, there is another control structure you could argue is going on, and that is these entheogens. Human religions so often can attribute their origin to the consumption of mushrooms and other kinds of intoxicants that generate encounters with the life after death, with the gods beyond this life. And there is an we don't know much about this because we don't have the classical education we should have. But Nietzsche talks about all this in The Birth of Tragedy. And he refers to not only to the Dionysian cults, but also to the Eleusinian mystery cults. Now, these were cults. Plato went to this. It was set up in Greece. You would go there, and apparently you would ingest an entheogen, and you would have an experience, basically what people report from mushrooms and DMT and stuff, basically of other domains of reality. And then this went on for almost 1,000 years before this cult was closed in the end of the 4th century. So that people say that throughout the Mediterranean basin, the same thing was going on. In India, we have this is ancient substance called soma, which did much the same thing. So people have hungered for an encounter with other dimensions, not satisfied with the limits of the world we live in, having moments where they have a sense that there's something deeper, but they developed these cult sites and practices throughout the world that gave people a boost into seeing beyond the limitations of everyday reality. So that's the other control structure, you might say, is that someone has helped provide a teaching that allowed people to make use of these substances, like for ayahuasca. no one out there could have possibly gone through all that and figured out which one was going to do this. So who did provide that guidance?
Now, that's extremely interesting, because people who have had ayahuasca experiences, or experiences with mushrooms, they often report that what they experience is realer than the reality that, we experience in the everyday. But also, you see it sometimes, like posted as a joke, is like, who was the first one trying these mushrooms and figuring out which ones were going to kill you and which were going to make you see God. But it's a really legitimate question,
Yep.
right? It's like, how did we discover this? First of all, the specific types of mushrooms would do this, these specific strains. And also, as you said, with ayahuasca, there was such a small chance, of all those different strains to actually isolate the one that would give you these types of experience. And when you ask them how they found out, they said it was the sky people. And I don't fully 100% know what to make of that, but
I don't either.
It's really interesting, right?
Well, there's a well-known, popular intellectual named Graham Hancock, who's written a number of books, The Footprints of the Gods and so on. And more recently, a book basically called something like The Supernatural, or I forget but he goes into great detail about these entheogens and the way they work and historical origins and so on. And there's a lot of other people too in the last 50 or 75 years who have emphasized the crucial role these substances have played in the development of human consciousness. And so there I see a reason to now think of a more complex educational or control structure that includes the entheogens as well as the sky people, the UAP. I would argue they've got to be somehow related. And I'm not skilled. I'm not an anthropologist. I don't know enough about that history. But there is I think, a research goldmine for people interested in UAP, alien abduction, and the role that both our own planet's plants and these otherworldly seeming sky people had the role all this has played in the history of humankind and how it has shaped different types of everyday life. Our everyday life in 1900, when Husserl was writing this stuff, man, it's really different from somebody in South America in 3,000 years BC doing stuff in the rainforest. So it's, there. That's probably enough for people get what I'm getting at, I guess. I hope.
No, absolutely. Definitely variations in culture and time period in terms of what we would accept in terms of this everydayness or this natural attitude. So what I want to move to now, well, just a follow-up question, I guess, on the natural attitude. As Husserl's natural attitude, and as you talked about Heidegger's everydayness, it really doesn't make room for anomalous phenomena of any kind. You're talking about UAP, but also, cryptids and orbs and, a variety of phenomena that we don't have straightforward explanations for and that are reported by individuals in basically every culture and every time period. So if the natural attitude makes no room for these, what would it mean, or what would it look like to introduce what might be called a supernatural attitude? Thinking about the works of Jeff Kripal, is that something that we could recover in our era that is so dominated by anthropocentric humanism? Is there room, or what changes would we have to make to introduce something like a supernatural attitude that does make room for anomalous phenomena?
Well, I think it's already going on. It's not been going on at the university level because let's face it, academic humanists to some extent are already a bit endangered, and so if we're going to go around talking about aliens and stuff. But now here's the advantage of tenure. I want to go back to that article I wrote in 1997 about the alien abduction phenomenon. I was a full professor. I was hanging out with John Mack, meeting these experiencers. I mean, it was mind-blowing. And yet, I had been long interested in it, and I realized, somebody has to step up with John Mack. He had a few scientists who were willing to, some physicists. Physicists are often the people most willing to step out because they're already pretty weird with quantum theory and stuff. So I said, look, you have a moral responsibility to take a stand with John Mack and to give philosophical credibility to the study of this phenomenon. I mean, the way I put it, it's an epistemological and ontological gold mine. Epistemology is a study of how we think and how we know what's true and false, and ontology is a study of what constitutes real things in the world. And the alien abduction phenomenon is an incredible, strange, powerful, widespread phenomenon that merits study. Now, one of the things that was shocking to me in the 1990s, when there were so many books coming out about all this and so many testimonials and so on, even if these abduction experiences were nothing but some kind of strange psychosis, let's put it that way. Now, I never believed that. It's just too complex. Well, where was the public health response? Where was the response of the sociologists, the psychological community, the National Institute of Health? Shouldn't there have been an effort to interview these people in that right kind of setting and to try to understand what's generating these phenomena? But there was a really strong silence about it. There were a few journals in psychology which published one or two special issues, but otherwise, the establishment scientific authority just turned away from it. Now, I couldn't believe it. Now, then I published this other one and came out in 2003, but I was a little concerned, but I never heard from anyone. It was as if these articles had never existed. So outside the mainstream they were. So I was and I also had a reputation. I'd published a lot, so that's how I could get away with it, I suppose. But I thought that lack of commitment for care for the population on the part of people who had that as a responsibility was a big instance of dropping the ball of responsibility.
Yeah, a couple of follow-up comments. I mean, just, again, commending you a bit on taking up that responsibility. John Mack, if the listeners or viewers don't know, he published, a book on this phenomenon, on the alien abduction phenomenon. And after that took place, his tenure and his medical license were called, into review. And he was, he got a lot of very serious criticism for taking this seriously. And there were very few professional academics, standing by him that this was something serious that needed to be looked at. And you are one of them, Michael. And I really think that that's something that's commendable. And, when I first started getting into this phenomenon, about 4 years ago now that I really started getting into it in a serious way, I was just looking for what philosophers must have said about this. I was thinking, I was like, people had to, have, really been interested in this, or, why haven't I heard more about this? And your articles, when searching the philosophical databases, yours are the only ones that came up, and that's how you first got in touch, because in terms of alien abduction in the philosophical literature, you were the only one saying anything about it.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that now will change with, me and several others who are hoping to, contribute with this kind of renewed interest in the subject, given some of the mainstream discussions. But that point you've raised with me before, I think is really important. Even if people did think that all that was going on was that these people reporting abduction into an alien craft had to be pathological or diseased in some way, even if that was their stance, which I'm with you, I don't think that's the case. And I think that the research doesn't reflect that it's all just pathology. But even if that's truly what they thought was the case, this should have been, of immediate attention and immediate concern. That there was this type of, that this many people were reporting this type of supposed psychosis, and yet there was just silence on it.
Yeah. Well, I think it shows the how effective the studied response by the federal government and the Department of Defense and the CIA around making any discussion of UFOs, aliens, and so on so taboo that you risk your own professional legitimacy even by mentioning this kind of thing. I mean, John Mack really stood out, right? He had much more exposure than I did. It was an incredible person. He died too young, but I think it reinforces this idea of how our everyday attitude, our natural attitude, is really limited. That by things you can't let in. John famously asked, this back in the, I suppose, when was he doing this? 1992 through 2000, probably 1993 or 4. A Boston Globe reporter, had asked him about this, and he knew this guy because John was famous already for his work with the whole against the nuclear arms race. One reason that he and I met was because we were both heavily involved in anti-war activity and a whole bunch of New Age stuff. We had this kind of parallel track before we actually finally met. But so John asked this reporter, he said, "Now look, let's say that a giant mothership, lands right on the Boston Commons at noon and is publicly witnessed by 50,000 people who are astounded by this craft and go up and touch it. I mean, it's real. Would you believe it?" And he said, this guy, you could just see him, the gears grinding. He said, "No, if I didn't see it, my own eyes, I couldn't believe it. I wouldn't believe it." Now, this shows the resistance. I mean, because that's a pretty strong case. And probably the most famous UFO case is Jacques Vallée has argued this is what happened at Lourdes in 1917 when the sun, it was an incredible event. You can look it up, the listeners, Lourdes. The sun suddenly became a disk which started falling down like a falling leaf in the pattern that so often UFOs take, and headed down toward the people, and they all panicked and so on. But then the sun came out again and dried everyone off from the rain. It was an unbelievable phenomenon that Vallée studied and spoke about. But what does it take to really? I suppose it becomes a personal matter. To what extent are you willing to expand your horizon of what can possibly show up within the life of a human being? And you have to, now when you hear this from a relative, like my brother apparently was abducted in the California mountains back in 1987. And he was telling me the story about it. He hadn't talked about it very often. The hair is standing up on his forearms. So horrifying was the experience. He can't remember those missing time after the craft came over. It's an incredible story. I'm going to publish it at some point soon. Then I discovered that 3 of my other siblings had similar or analogous types of experiences, which I had never heard about. And then I asked myself, why was I so concerned about nuclear war from almost when I could begin thinking about these things? The whole nuclear war thing was a major part of my life, right into the end of the Cold War. And then I asked myself, given how often people who are abducted, or if you think about also the Space Brothers from the 1950s, these craft coming and telling people to stop nuclear war and so on, the connection between UFOs, educational project, control project, or structure, and that my concern about this, my family seemingly involved with aliens in some way, it gives me real pause. Now, I don't have any recollection of anything like this. I've looked, but nothing back there. But it has raised questions about my family history that are worth exploring, to me, at least personally. But when you hear a relative tell you these things, and you know there's no con job here, and look at the poor devil, he's writhing, and you know, just even remembering it, then you know something powerful happened. Clearly beyond ordinary. It's a very accomplished, creative guy. So I think that it's important to have the superhumanities come on the scene. That's how it happens gradually, is permission given for people to say, yes, I'm taking this seriously, I'm listening. And I think that these things happen all over the place, and we should all learn more about it. And I think that the courses, you just finished a course online on phenomenology and the abduction phenomenon, and that went quite well, didn't it? So I think there is an audience there who would be interested in having philosophers talk about these matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I taught on phenomenology, and I actually did close encounters of the first through fifth kinds. So we did, but we did you know, from very simple encounters to very complex ones, and it was very successful. And the students in it were so engaged, and you know, the quality of the conversation was very, very high. So I agree with you that I think to an extent it's already happening. But maybe the first step to it happening is we have to give ourselves permission, and we have to give each other permission to take these experiences seriously and say these are important things that are worth talking about.
Yeah. The place that this has had a home in academia is to some extent in folklore. In folklore departments, you can talk about all kind of weird stuff, you know, voodoo and aliens and sky people and so on, because you bracket the question of their ultimate reality. You're simply studying the cultural influence that these intrusive entities have had on peoples, and how peoples in different times and places have interpreted them and related to them and so on. So there is some room in folklore and anthropology. But now I think with your good experience with teaching this course online, I think that we should encourage people we know in the humanities. I remember when I first taught philosophy and science fiction 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, I always loved science fiction, but we started with The Matrix, the trilogy. We just watched the first film because it raises so many incredible philosophical questions. Now, the idea of introducing science fiction into a philosophy class would have been impossible in 1950 or 1960 or 70 perhaps. But by the 2000s, you could, in 1990s, you could start doing this because science fiction had so saturated the public through television and movies primarily, that everyone had some sense of its importance for raising provocative questions about human identity, the human future, what would happen if aliens from elsewhere showed up, that it became more than a folklore phenomenon, but something worthy of investigation by psychologists and anthropologists and sociologists and philosophers and people in literature as well. So I think we are, certainly our students are much more, I think, open to these matters, perhaps at least admitting interest in the matter, these matters and before, because everyone has, many people who grew up in my generation at least, for them, this woo-woo stuff is just not something you talked about in public.
Yeah, even in my, you know, philosophy courses that I teach, you know, at Molloy in my day job, you know, I introduced some of like Jeffrey Kripal's work, you know,
Right.
and love it. You know, to be honest, they love to talk about these kind of things, and you know, some of them, you know, like to talk about their own encounters. But I you know, I've seen that students, at least college students, are really open to these topics.
I think so too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, there was a recent survey I cited in this essay I've been working on. That's like 70% of American people interviewed have had one of these 12 or 13 kind of abnormal, paranormal experiences. I mean, how many people have had precognition? You know who's calling on the phone? How many people have precognition and knowing that something terrible happened to their grandmother? At the same time you had that dream last night, she was dying, or these are so widespread. And not to mention poltergeist phenomena, which have been carefully studied on several occasions over years by teams of psychologists and physicists and so on, trying to make sense of this. Here's the bottom line, and think about it. Our understanding of consciousness is so pitifully low because of centuries of neglect. Anything about consciousness is relegated to literature, where people could talk about interior states. Philosophy in much of the 20th century was guided by behaviorism. When I was a graduate student, you didn't hear anything about first-person experience. And that's why I was attracted to Nietzsche and Heidegger and Sartre and these people, because in Europe, you could still talk about subjectivity, the phenomenon of internal time consciousness, all this kind of stuff, which appealed to me. But I think we're now undergoing a change. And I would add this, 15 or 16 seasons of what's it called? Alien, the Alien series, Alien Visitors, what's it called? Ancient Aliens. Right. Because not so much because I believe there are actually, beings from other planets who visit us, maybe they have, but the idea that human history and culture have been shaped in strange ways by these encounters with sky people all over the world, whatever they're called. This, I think, and it's very slick. These are fun productions. Although my problem with the episodes I watch, is it possible that X, Y, and Z? Ancient alien experts say yes. Now, what I'd like to see is ancient alien experts say, I got to draw the line on this one. It's just not possible. Anyway, I go on too much. But I think that's also played a bigger role than we may think in softening up the population for taking seriously intrusive and strange phenomena of all kinds that used to be in the closet.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any line that they're willing to draw. So
Right.
Yes, definitely. So we try to be a little bit more skeptical. But you're correct. It's definitely, these strange encounters, again, unknown origin, where exactly they're coming from, what exactly they are,
Yep.
what exactly their status is, but they have been witnessed by human societies throughout centuries, and they've shaped human cultures throughout centuries.
Yep. Now, for people in the humanities, how could you not be interested in this? If human identity, its religion, its cultural artifacts, its worldviews have been shaped by entities that we don't understand or have been taught not to even think or talk about, that's a real dropping of the ball on our part. So I do hope people in philosophy and literature, in other domains of the humanities will start stepping up and introducing some of these topics right into their courses, because there's one way to get higher course enrollment, and that's by offering courses with topics that really fire people's rockets, like philosophy and science fiction. I always had maximum enrollment in that course. Yeah.
Absolutely. There seems to be something that, inherently draws people to these topics. So Michael, I wanted to talk to you one more topic, one more question. You brought up at the very beginning, the difficulties sometimes of applying the phenomenological method, because ideally, now, and some of what I did in the course I taught was, applying the phenomenological method to eyewitness accounts in the aftermath. So it's like applying it to, the remembrance of their experience that they have now, written down for others to read and decipher. But ideally, Husserl intended for the phenomenological reduction to be experienced or to be applied, in the first person while the event is happening. And as you said, that's extremely difficult to do. Number one, like in a normal situation, to really just, bracket, all of the meaning, bracket the natural attitude, kind of suspend it and just look at what is appearing to you. But becomes especially difficult when we're talking about UAP encounters, because UAP encounters there's all kinds of elements to them that force you out of the everyday and make it even more difficult, to be able to apply this as it's happening, such as, first of all, just being mesmerized by the presence of a craft or some type of unknown object that you're seeing. But also, sometimes people report being physically paralyzed. And you studied the alien abduction phenomenon where people would report beings coming through their wall, coming through their window, or they themselves, first of all, being paralyzed, but then, having the experience of being floated out their window, and taken into a craft.
You're right, out through their closed window.
They're right. Yeah, absolutely. Or sometimes right through the wall,
Yeah.
So things that by our understanding of the natural attitude, or just by our general understandings of the boundaries of reality, are not supposed to occur. Yet in the conscious experience, that's what they're perceiving. So how does that just kind of complicate, the application of the phenomenological method, or the practice of phenomenology, applying it in real time?
Yeah, that's right. That becomes a really big problem. I think part of it, what you could say is, you have to have a certain training already, or else you have to have a certain capacity to remain present in situations which are scary and threatening. Now, some people can do that. Something kicks in, and I've seen people in emergency situations who aren't blown away by it, but somehow they click into what's wanted and needed here, and they go toward it, and so that they're all attentive to just what's happening. But many of us would just be like Whitley Strieber's book on this called Communion, where he's recounting his own alien abduction, although he doesn't know what these beings were or are. They may be alien, but he doesn't know, he says. But he thought the first title for the book was going to be Body Terror. He was so horrified by what was going on that at one point, one of these critters said to him, "Can we do anything to help you stop screaming?" Now, when you're screaming and panicky like this, you're not the best observer. So some people, on the other hand, have been quite good about staying with what was going on and being able to report as best they could just what was happening, also their response to it, and being able to separate them out in a way that's pretty cogent, and it gives one a sense of, this person managed to get through this and recollect so much of it, sometimes without hypnosis or any of these other questionable or practices. And that's pretty impressive. That was true of my brother. He remembered a lot about his experience up till the point where he just blanked out. But that's for another time, I guess. That'll be the next episode. So,
Well, I was going to say, I think from what we've discussed, I might love to have you back on at a future date, because I know that there's many more things that we could continue to go on about, because this topic is so rich and I think
yes.
so important. And you've done great things so far in terms of, making this a serious topic of philosophical conversation. And so I again want to thank you for the work that you've done on this subject in the past, and the work that you're continuing to do on it in the present. You're continuing to, working on the, writing essays, coming on for interviews. It's really important that we continue to have your important voice on this. You have a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and obviously a lot of topics. And I just wanted to say that I have really enjoyed this conversation and everything that you've contributed. Are there any lingering last thoughts that you'd like to leave for our viewers today?
Well, I think there's so much. I'd just like to conclude by thanking you for having me on this program, and for your taking a stand in our discipline of philosophy, indicating that there are topics here that are available and that deserve inquiry on the part of other professional philosophers, and that, and just as Jeff Kripal has and Diane Basulka PASOKA have been doing in religious studies, inviting their colleagues to step up and engage with these phenomena, which many people experience, that there's something to them and they merit study. So I want to hats off to you as well for everything you're doing right now. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for staying with us on this, throughout this conversation. I know we covered a lot of ground, and I hope to see, or not see, but I hope too that you'll join us for future conversations of phenomenology of the phenomenon. Once again, thank you so much to our guest, Michael E. Zimmerman, Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at University of Colorado Boulder.
Bye-bye.
Bye.